It starts.
Just say, there we go.
Rifle season.
Ready to roll?
Deer season. I think it's
Good morning.
most of my friends have already gone.
Today is Tuesday, the 31st of October.
Yep.
This is the Act 47 Building Energy Code Study Committee's 7th meeting. And we have a lot of material to go through today. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your ongoing participation. And thanks to the team of folks that have worked on a draft document for us to review. Actually, we have more than one draft, so as a organizational thing, I would say if anyone, I'll step all the way to the highest level, 60,000 feet. The report we're writing is a committee report. The department's been charged in the bill to facilitate the work of the committee, and EFT has been as the contractor, the department, and then for the committee to help us get that work done. So in order to help us stay coordinated, I would say everyone's welcome to contribute, of course. That's the whole point of having an expert group like this. But in terms of helping us keep things organized, I'd say if you have, if you want to edit a draft, please, modify that draft and put your name front and center on the cover and maybe as a running header and or footer, because otherwise it's like, whoa, which one? We have a lot of paper, and I know people are busy. So if there are 2 or 3 versions of it around and you pick it up and you're not sure, is this the one I'm really supposed to review, or is this one step out of date, whatever, it would be really helpful to everyone. If you want to edit, please do. Just label your work so we all know whose words we're seeing when we see another version. And so before we get into details for the sake of helping us stay organized, I'm going to do our quick roll call just so that we know who's here, and then we'll go on to minutes, and then we'll jump into the work. So for today, I'm going to read off names, and I'll go faster if I don't keep looking up at the screen trying to find initials or faces. Ted Brady.
Is here.
He's here.
Okay, thank you. Jim Bradley.
Not here, but he'll show up as he can.
Okay. Chris Burns.
Is here.
Yep. Chris Anthony.
Here.
Yes. Scott Campbell.
Here.
Mike DeRocher. Bob Duncan.
He's at a doctor's appointment, so Matt Bushy from AIA Vermont is right there.
So.
And then when Bob arrives, they're gonna switch out.
Okay, great. Thank you. Kelly.
Yep.
Matt. Craig Peltier.
Here.
Thank you. Tim Perrin.
Tim Perrin is double booked today, and I'm Karen Horn, and I'm representing Vermont Gas in his absence.
Thank you. Matt Sharp.
Yeah.
Jason Webster.
I'm here.
I'm here.
Great. Sandy, right there. Other folks that are joining us. So Andrew Brewer, saw you. Tom Bursey. Ben Cipoletti.
Here.
Here.
Yep, great. Ellen is here. Ellen Chakowski. Caroline Daniels. Ed Dumas. Richard's here. Michelle Farnham.
Is here.
Hi, good morning.
Morning. Colin Frisbee.
Here.
Great. Josh Hanford.
I'm here instead of Josh today. It's Ted.
Okay, thank you. Karen Horn. So do we have 2 Karen Horns?
No,
That's the same Karen Horn.
Same Karen Horn.
I couldn't see. I didn't. All right. So, who knows? Thank you. Keith Levinson.
Is not here.
He is not here. He is in Bosnia.
Barry. Yep. Stu Sloat.
Here.
Thank you. Peter Tucker. Scott Bursey. Okay. Anyone whose name I didn't call out?
Adam says he's here.
Okay. And so we got Walt, anyone else? Great, okay, thanks so much. It's always helpful, a little tedious, but helpful. So with that, we have minutes from the prior meeting. And I'm looking to see if there are any edits to those or comments from those meetings. Sandy?
I just have one small one on page 5.
Yep.
My comments towards the bottom end, on number 4, we're trying to gather case studies, not anecdotes. And I may have used the word anecdotes, but I didn't mean that.
Oh, okay, so studies,
Yeah, or, yeah, case studies, 'cause,
Yeah.
you know, actual evidence.
yeah, a little more formal than anecdotes. Okay,
Yes, sir.
got it, thank you. Anybody else have an edit? Okay. I did have a quick question. So on the very last page, page 5, I had to leave just before the end. Sorry about that. Number 5, paying for the Energy Code Administration, says this discussion never occurred. So I'm guessing it was on the agenda. We didn't get to it, and it's sort of perpetually on our agenda. We all see a lot of work ahead over time, and we all wonder, how do we make it affordable? Okay.
Did you want to change that at all, or is that?
No, I just
Here's the
sort of
question.
flagging it,
Okay.
because I know we'll want to come back to it. And then in number 6, in A, it says new RVs would bring 18 to 30K to housing costs. So it's under, Andrew, it's under your name. So is there a study, or I'm not familiar with the figure, and I don't know if that means that the RVs that are set to go into effect next year, that someone has done a study of it, and that 18 to 30K number is the result of some analysis. So does anyone own that figure?
That was a quote from Andrew.
Okay. And is Andrew still here? Yeah. Let me just check with Andrew Brewer. You see your initials, but maybe you stepped away. There you are. On the RV, so there's that page 8, the figure of 18 to 30K. Do you know where that comes from?
I'll take, this is Jason Webster. I'll take Andrew off the hot seat. That figure, I'm not looking at it, but I'm pretty sure that figure came from the DPS code hearings, and that was a figure that was used to compare the 2015 code, which is the last one we think we at least had 50% compliance with, and the net cost to the 2020 code, or no, not the 2020, the 2023 code.
Okay.
So that was a number where we were, instead of looking at incremental cost of code to code, was more of, let's look at what people are actually building to the costs of the proposed code. I think that's, I'm not looking at it, but I think that's where that number came from.
Okay, all right. Well, and so now I can come back to you another time too if I want to dig into it a little more. I hadn't heard the number before. It's a significant number, and wanted to understand it a little better.
I'm happy to dig out the original cost calculations that have all the numbers and the rationale for why we were looking at that number, and I can email that.
Sure. And Jason, do you know if that is some portion of that 2015 to 2023 change just inflation for materials, or that's if you were to build today to the 2015 code versus the 2023 code today?
That's an important distinction. That was 2015 code built today, the 2023 code built today. So it was today's look at both sets of costs.
Thank you. Okay.
Are you suggesting this is gets modified to make that clarification, or? Because it doesn't say that context of compared to 2015 compared to.
Right. So how about we add that in just for clarity? Can you
Into the into the minutes.
It's a minute, it's just a clarification.
Is that okay, Andrew, that if we added the clarification so it's clear what that number is?
I
in the
think that
minutes?
works. Jason, does that work for you? Yeah.
Great, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, of course.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
of course. I mean, of course. I mean, that's what the number is it's,
Thank you.
So we'll do that. We'll add that.
All right, thanks. Sandy?
I'm sorry, this is going backwards in your agenda, but I have a text from Jim Bradley. And he had to go onto a job site unexpectedly
Okay.
with a little emergency. So Colin is here. Colin can represent Jim.
All right, thank you. Real-time updates, all right. Anything else on minutes? All right, if there are no further changes, look for a motion to approve.
So move.
Thank you. Any further edits, discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? Ayes have it. Okay, minutes are approved. Thanks very much. Let's jump right in, back to the next item on our agenda, which is the draft report. So I think it actually originated with Liz. We have a draft that is dated 10/24/23, and then there is a little bit of there's a revision, there's already a revision to it. So in the header, you'll see 10/24/23 draft. Scott, you provided some edits that are in this and flagged. Is that correct?
Oh, I don't know whether they're in the draft that was sent around. I don't think so.
It might have gone to a few of us, but not to everybody.
All right. So then we should stick with the 10/24/20, the generic draft without edits. So again, because there are a lot of details for us that we could address. And so as a strategy, I thought maybe what we could do is go through this draft and sort of check things off and do a little sorting, prioritizing. And the way I thought about it, so that we don't get bogged down in trying to sort out 80 details, is to do sort of a tier one, things that we have to have. And by have to have, I'm thinking the bill asks us to do certain things. So we have a charge to deliver on, and then and then LCAR also asked for a delay in implementation in order to provide for this working group to deliver recommendations to a legislative group to make changes prior to implementation of the current code. So there is there's sort of a near-term window of things that are more pressing. There's other things for sure that we have said, for instance, we talked about very briefly a few months ago, funding. How are we going to fund things over time? So for me, that I would think we might address that as a tier two item. And it needs to be addressed. We're highlighting and flagging it. We may even have proposals, but we're not necessarily saying we're trying to get all the way to a final recommendation for what might unfold over the next 7 years. And that way we can make sure we deliver on a report that addresses what we need to address, and we can also highlight what we know is part of a more comprehensive, forward-looking view for the legislature, which I think my guess is that there'll be a bill this year, and that there'll be bills in subsequent sessions as well. Let's keep moving. All right. So with that, Richard, you have I think everyone got that 10/24 draft from your shop. And
Share that.
yeah, if we could share that and go through, and if people have comments as we work, let's share the comments in the group, see how we do pacing wise to walk through fully. I know that Sandy, you and others, you just brought in a hard copy, so we'll do the copy that's distributed to everyone first. We'll take comments from people as we go, and then I hope we'll still have time. We'll double back to the draft that you offered and look at discuss those and think about incorporating things from that draft into like the committee version. Just call it the committee version. Yes, please.
With the committee version, as we were moving through, we made a number of very small edits. We made, mostly it was insertion of extra information. And sometimes we rarely thought it was better to adjust order of things for flow. So while we're going through the committee version, should we just flag if there was something that changed in this one?
Sure.
Because I think some of us had well, when we were working on the AIA group, there were these parts that didn't, so I just don't know how to.
Yeah, so why don't you call them out? We can discuss
say
that
flag.
some as we
Yep.
go. I'm just sort of trying to manage, not going so deep and so detailed that we don't make it all the way through as a group. So if it turns out that we're getting too detailed to make it through pacing wise, then let's just flag it and we'll move on and then come back to your draft where it'll be easier to see those suggestions.
Do you have a version that has track changes in it? Because it's really hard to understand what.
It was so heavily tracked that we couldn't edit it. So at some point, because we had to get rid of our track changes. The short answer is no, because we couldn't even look at the text. I think in Google Docs, there is a way to look at the history of comments. So there might be a way to reconstruct it, but at a certain point we accepted because we got to the point where we couldn't edit it anymore.
So I'm just, the process, it's really going to be challenging for us if the group is starting from, Mike, you were going to say something. But,
No, you're fine. I just think that we have to work off a common draft.
That's
here.
where I was
agree.
going, right.
Just,
We agree. One way forward might be to look at the overall structure of the document as if we were looking at an outline, and just because we've pretty much stuck to that, and that might be a useful foundation. And then looking at the structure within each of the sections, and then actually going into text. I think that might be the least disorienting, but we just did this to try to be helpful. We had to do it in the way we could think. So however the group wants to go forward, we're happy to assist.
Okay, great. So I think we'll stick with the committee document, the common draft, might just call it a good name for it, and we'll then we'll work our way all the way through. We can flag things as we go. As time allows, we'll come back to the draft. You have to look for items, and then I would leave it to the discretion of the editors that are producing the document for how to incorporate rather than rewrite on their behalf. Okay.
So the other process thing I think is important too is you had suggested, we were talking before the meeting, about a way to decide, a process for deciding how we're going to end up with the recommendations. And I mean, we'd sort of organize the agenda too. I mean, certainly we can walk through it this way, but I just want to make sure that by the time we get through this, we have had a chance to focus primarily on the recommendations. I feel like that's where we want to emphasize. So I just want to flag that. And you suggested doing a survey or something maybe outside of this process too. I don't know if you want to bring that up.
So when we finish, my hope is that we'll end up with a series of recommendations. We might also have for the things that that sort of need to do, and other things that we know we someday need to address. It doesn't necessarily have to be a final recommendation now. Turn them into a series of poll, put them into a poll, send them off. Everyone can reply anonymously, and we can just get in a very efficient, private way, like that we'll share the results, of course, but like that everyone can vote and say where you are on each of the questions. And then we'll at least have a sense of where we are without trying to vote each thing as we edit as a group, which I think could become pretty burdensome. And some people are online, some people are some people are remote, some people are in the room. It's like a hassle.
And should we talk about what happens when there's not consensus or there's difference of opinion? I just think it's important for us to, as editors and authors, we're gonna need to know how to convey the outcome of these results.
Yeah. So I think, my suggestion would be let's do our walkthrough today. So get away from sort of theory of what will happen and see how it goes. And then we could use the poll to quantify what's going on. And I've never conceived of a report as having to be a consensus report. If it turns out on a particular recommendation where 15 of 18 say yes, it's like, okay, so it's a pretty good sense of a lot of support, but there are people with other points of view and we want to convey the range of thoughts.
Consensus is not unanimity. It's important to make that distinction as well. Right. We may not have unanimous support for the whole stuff.
Yeah. Chris?
I like the poll idea, but can we do that under open meeting law?
I'm not your attorney.
We've
Ben?
been doing it in the RES working group.
Yes.
Yes.
So.
Okay.
Must have
Good
been-
question.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be a troublemaker.
Yeah,
Just
no,
thought-
Trying to keep us out of trouble. Okay, great. So let's work on and see how it goes, and we'll have a sense of what makes sense for edit.
I just had a quick question, and if it's answered in the way I think it's answered, I have a recommendation maybe. And that is, are all the other comments you have, other than the extensive work AIA did with their own draft, on your draft?
No, not yet. We've collected them.
No, I know, but were they, no one else edited this, right? They edited your draft,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, so we have some of those were provided as marked up versions of our draft. Some of them, like yours, were 3 sets of bullets that came in as email. But we've pulled those together. They're not in the draft that I'm sharing up here, but we have all those. They're all based on the 1024 draft we sent out.
Right, that's what I thought. So maybe this will be helpful, maybe it wouldn't, just to go through those, if they're sort of like the ones I sent in. I don't know how extensive they are. And then have maybe a new revised draft out of that we get to today, and then go through this and see what we make sense out of this to go into the main document. That's one way to handle it, because I could see this is so extensive. If we go through the AIA draft concurrent with this draft, it's going to take a while.
Well, we'll stick with the committee version first.
Yeah.
We can add things in as time allows. My concern is that we keep focused on the committee version for now, so that we can get a complete draft that goes start to finish. Then we can look at supplementing. I also thought, thanks for that question. We have formally scheduled one more meeting, but my sense is we'll need one more meeting to review a draft that's a redraft based on this meeting, and maybe some follow-up. And then I would think we would want to have the chance to make a final set of edits as a group, and then vote on a clean document after that. So in other words, I don't know if we need a second meeting all the way out, like a full meeting like this, or if we want to just do it virtually, have a Zoom meeting, like sort of convene to look at a clean copy, sort of sign off as a group. We can figure that out depending on the extent that it's going. Trying not to add meetings, but I also sense that we need more than one more look at the document to get over the finish line.
Just to be clear, maybe I wasn't clear. What I was suggesting is that we don't have Sandy even comment at first. And when I said we'll go through her draft, like I was implying that we always stick with your draft throughout the entire process, but that we don't. I'm just seeing if these guys start weighing in on every single line item, it's going to take a while. Maybe that is a way to handle it. I was just thinking we could get the other comments out of the way and then go back to that document and then go through the AIA comments. That's what, so just to be clear, what I was suggesting, and that may not be a good idea.
I don't have that you're talking.
No. And there's sort of summary, I mean, it was just sort of internal work and this summarizing it up in a page. I mean, I could share that if that would be.
I don't know if that makes sense to other people. If what I'm saying makes sense to people, we can just drop it and do what you're planning.
Well, these seem brief enough that I think that's the kind of thing I figured people would bring up as we walk through the committee.
Right.
Right. I think that works.
So let's stick with that. Okay. All right. So, Richard, if you.
So, do you want me to start at I could start. So,
yeah.
Acknowledgements. I mean, there's
The acknowledgements, we would like to include thanking people who testified.
Sure, right, and I figured, there's, I have a couple notes, like, we would also probably list committee members and stuff like that. Okay, but, all right.
So you want to list the committee members up front, okay?
Seems like,
Yeah.
If I've seen lists. So we know when the people who read it know who it is.
Yeah.
And I suppose, committee members and who they're representing. People have the idea.
The acronyms that we get captured by Snow. We come back to the executive summary.
Yeah, I would think that makes sense. I always figure like you write the executive summary once you're done.
Right. Findings. So there were a couple suggested additional findings. So we basically pulled the findings from the legislation and then added a couple more. And I know that Scott, you had a finding about single office administering energy codes that you had suggested being an additional.
Yeah.
Was that in the original bill? Or you were talking?
Oh, no, well, these are findings. So the original list of findings was in Act 47. And then there were two additional findings being listed here as sort of committee findings. One was the lacking an authority having jurisdiction is hampering energy code administration. And the second was lack of a statewide building code, residential building code is also hindering energy code administration. And I was trying to clarify as to why that is. So I suggested adding, because the state lacks the scaffolding infrastructure that building code administration provides. And then I added another, suggested the third finding, which clarified that there are two offices involved in energy code development and administration and building code administration. Just to make that clear that was where we're starting from.
I have a question on that statement. There is right now one state entity, right, that does energy efficiency, and that is the Department of Public Service. So just to clarify that statement, maybe Kelly can expand upon that, but there is only one state entity right now that has authority over the energy efficiency codes.
Right. That's what I was saying. Is where I was trying to make the distinction between energy code administration or energy code work and building code work. Right.
I have a comment that I had on the executive summary, the findings and this. I think it's confusing to use the word administer. I think that means different things to different people. Like I would actually say the department administers the code,
Mhm.
but I think there's maybe a terminology used in the building sector that means more than that. Like I think later there's a description of administering, including plan review, the enforcement act, what I think of enforcement activities. So I would just like us to be clear up front and then throw out what word mean and maybe not use the word administer, maybe be more precise about what we're saying. Because I agree with what Michael's saying that there is one entity in charge and just parsing out again, like if we're going to use the word administer, define it. But my preference would be to just be more precise in our language on what we're really saying.
Well, thanks. Being clear about what we mean by things is really key. I mean, maybe we want, in bills, we end up defining terms up front so that people know what we mean by it. So when you say administer being seen by some people as something broader, for instance, we've talked about reconciling when there's conflict between codes, who adjudicates that, who resolves that, or who oversees inspections, or et cetera, et cetera.
Right, that's what I'm saying. I think that the department fills some roles of what we have down as administration. Like we do code interpretation. We actually have statements in CBs because that's where it's relevant that the fire code proceeds or, would receive precedence over energy code. But the department, if a conflict came up, the department would work with fire safety on what the solution is. So there is that role that's being filled, but it doesn't include some of the other things like on-site inspections or plan reviews. So I just want to be clear about what happens, who has authority, and what we don't maybe have authority over.
I think in typical parlance I've always used jurisdiction would be permitting and enforcement. I know there's no permits necessarily in this case, but those are the things, right? There's overall administration, like you were talking about. Then ultimately, it's the act of pulling a permit and then enforcing the code. We can talk about other ways to characterize, but I think that's fairly common.
We're gonna afterwards provide. I don't want to wordsmith in the meeting, right?
Yeah.
And we're gonna provide actual track changes of what we would suggest. But I just wanted to get the concept out there and make sure people agreed with that.
Sounds like it might be useful to list all that, and I think we've done this in other places,
Yeah,
but
yes.
it's not just up front. Like, what are all the tasks? Who does them currently, and,
Right.
or which
And who
ones-
doesn't.
and which things aren't assigned to anyone?
I mean, to some extent, you did that
Yeah.
in one of you had one sheet for RVs and one for CVs that sort of laid out all of those tasks and who was responsible.
In the back of this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So someone else has just joined. Can they mind identifying themselves?
Jim Bradley, mobile.
Thanks, Jim.
Ms. Bradley. Yeah,
So,
thank you.
At first, I just want to say, point out that the AIA document's been a real team effort. There were 4 of us working pretty intensely on this. So Matt Bushy is, I would say, the co-author of this version. We have just 2 flags for this section. One was for clarity. We thought that anything that took one of the legislative suggestions further might just be marked with italics. That's one flag included up there. And then the other is that we thought that the second, if you go down, Richard, the second one was confusing to people who are in construction. So we actually, I'm just flagging that we suggested some different wording for that. And then we added
One
one.
talks about building code. Are we talking about item 2 there?
Yes, sir.
Statewide residential building code.
So I'm just
So
flagging.
you're Flagging that you have.
So I didn't understand oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You're just saying, okay, so we're flagging you have a possible alternative language around that.
Yep, and then we added a third, which down there, which was about the number of building failures that are related to energy codes. Thank you.
Chris?
I'm going to propose actually adding I guess it would be a finding, and I forget who I sent this to, but I'm now on the Hazard Mitigation Plan Project Review Committee for the state. And Stephanie Smith, who leads that, she's with Vermont Emergency Management, said, as I noted in our call last week, Vermont is not competitive under the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Fund through FEMA competitive funding because we do not have a statewide residential building code. This limits us to spending only under a state set aside each year, which means we can do planning and scoping, but can likely not complete infrastructure projects under BRIC. And that's a major funding source through FEMA. We did just get the notice of funding for BRIC 23 after I started this email. And it looks like building codes are now only worth 20 of 200 competitive points instead of 40. So that will help, but we still have to get the most, if not all, of the other points. And there are a lot of larger coastal states that can oversubscribe the competitive pot on their own. So I just was going to suggest, and what I would suggest is have Stephanie provide specific language from BEM explaining this, and add like perhaps a number 3 that just, because to me this is important information that the legislature needs to have. Just to say that while not directly related to the building efficiency code, the absence of a building code may in fact preclude the state's competitiveness for millions of FEMA BRIC dollars. So I forget who I shared this with, but I'll pass it along again. But I'll just have suggest Stephanie Smith scrap that language.
And I kind of piggybacking on what Chris said. I don't think one of the things for anybody reading this report that I think is really important to understand is I don't think that in the General Assembly findings, item number 3, where it talks about DFS is responsible for development, administration, enforcement of building codes. I don't think that language is clear enough to let most of the General Assembly know that there are no building codes for single family residential.
Right.
And I think that should be, as Chris is saying, I think that needs to be maybe in our additional findings, item number 3, an explicit statement that there are no building codes for single family residential.
Surprise to most people when it becomes clear, when people assume that of course there's a building code because they hear about codes, but not necessarily building code. Yeah, Sandy.
Senator, I think what we've discussed in VBRA and in AIA Vermont is actually submitting a companion bill to this bill that takes some of the pressure off of asking for a residential code, which is kind of out of the scope of the energy code bill. The idea would be to create a companion bill. We're supposed to be making a report for Scott on that, to do some background research for him, so that it could take that contentious item out of this bill.
Okay. It's worth, since we don't know about, we only are controlling our own work, so I think it's fine, it's helpful for someone reading the report. There'll be some people who will only see this report, so that they just know what's
it should be
on
here.
The table, what's sort of off the table.
Totally agreed, but I didn't know if everybody at the table knew that we're working on a separate bill for that.
Okay. Anything else on this section before we want? All right. So,
Yes, this is Matt Bushy. I just wanted to add a comment on this section, a broad comment to follow up on what Sandy started to touch on. We spent a lot of time on this section and the following section, which is the assessment. Our approach was to keep the findings very factual and succinct, following the lead of the 5 original findings. So any, sorry, there's a train going by here. Any additional analysis we pushed to the following section. And to make this more clear, we suggest changing the word problems to findings. So the next section would read assessment of findings and underlying issues. so you can more clearly understand that the first section is just the facts, very succinct, and then we go into that in more detail with an assessment in the second section.
Okay. And thanks for reminding us. I mean, findings are supposed to be, as best we know, facts, or, you know, sometimes we might have a finding that we're pointing out an issue that's unresolved. So it's not necessarily that we have the answer, but thanks for that. Okay, so let's keep reading forward. So we're
Senator?
Yes.
Before we move on, I would like to make a comment.
Sure.
On it's a small one, something I sent over to Richard's crew. The talk on number 4 about 54% compliance. I suggested we put a sort of a clarification in there that is, you know, that's looking at the thermal efficiency of the code. It's not looking at the entire requirements of the code. And I think it's important to make that distinction in a couple places. We're holding on to this 54% mark, but you know, if we look at things like equipment sizing as part of code, that's 7% compliance, or ventilation system installation, that's 30% compliance. So I just want to make that distinction. So we're not just wholly saying 54% compliance across the board.
Okay, thanks. Useful to have a little more insight through that additional granularity. You know, and this is reminding me now, seeing how it works as we go. I think if people will collect comments as we go, but I think if you, it would be helpful if anyone who wants to share comments gets them into writing and then sends them on to Richard, so that he's always, you know, all the comments funnel through his shop, so that so if you have written comment, if you have comments other than something pretty straightforward.
Can we cite the studies that they're talking? The studies. What studies were the studies that we're referencing?
It's a market assessment study that the department does, but we'll put in the title.
It is, and it is footnoted. Well,
Is it?
Well, not here, but further down it is.
Is that
I know it's footnoted in here as when we brought it up, but I think we'll have to bring it back up if we're going to cite it at this point.
Yeah, I think if you're going to say study,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
use numbers, we need to
Definitely, yeah.
maybe
Thank
not
you,
now,
Max.
but I think
Yeah.
we do need to set a deadline for getting comments, written comments,
Thank you.
and at some point.
Yes.
But we should go through because we
Okay.
might not.
I don't have it right in front of me. Do you know that our next meeting is for
No,
the 16th?
November 16th.
Yeah, so we have 2 weeks.
And that was listed as an optional meeting that we hadn't confirmed yet, but I think it's on, I think I sent the calendar invite.
Okay, so today is Tuesday. How about if we set a deadline of this Friday for comments to your shop? Is that timely enough on your
Yeah,
end?
that would be good.
Okay. Anyone have a problem with today's Tuesday, the next?
I wanted to get through the comments just because it might depend on wordsmithing that people feel like they need to do. I think Friday is optimal, but I just don't know. The department might be able to do it.
Okay, so let's, for ourselves, aim to have written comments to, to Richard by this Friday. Post business Friday. So we'll have time to collate, edit, et cetera, and bring forward the draft, because before our next meeting, we'll want to turn out a draft for review prior to that meeting.
Yeah, maybe Monday the 13th.
The next draft.
The meeting's on the 16th.
That would be optimal for us. That would
would
give
give-
us next
that would
week
give
to
you
work
a
on it.
week, yeah.
Right.
So
What do you
then-
think, Liz? I mean, I think we're, it's on the 13th.
We're shooting for these dates. I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
Okay, so a draft's out on the 13th, meeting again on the 16th. Okay, thank you. All right, so anything else before we move on into assessment of findings and issues. Okay.
Did you intentionally strike underline in your phrasing of that section?
No.
Okay,
No.
okay.
We also proposed analysis of findings, and assessments of findings would be great. But I think the word findings was more important than assessment versus analysis.
Okay. Any comments about the, let's just start paragraph by paragraph here. So anything on this page that's up on the screen now?
Yes.
Sandy?
In general, we wanted to avoid narrative text, keep condensing it as much as possible so that people will keep reading. And we absolutely wanted to avoid repetition of concepts, even if there's a broad one. I mean, sometimes it's necessary to have a very brief introduction and then later much fuller detail, but just avoiding repetition of detail. So that's a flag. And the other flag is that, Matt, maybe you could explain the graph change that's right below those three texts and if there's no other, when we get there.
Okay. So before we scroll down to that graph, chart, whatever, anything on this page that people on the fly? Okay. So let's go to the chart. So you want to know that you have a revised version of this? Is that what you're saying? Sandy?
So yes, we have a proposed revised chart that tries to, some of it is graphic and it tries to clarify that we have two lines that are measuring against two different scales and two different units of measurement. And we're also, the AIA Vermont chart also extends this to the year 2030 to show the energy code's kind of goal for striving towards net zero towards 2030 and kind of extrapolating a continued downward compliance rate.
How do we know?
How do we know that? Yes.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I don't think it's appropriate to forecast out a declining compliance rate at all. There's a lot of compliance mechanisms, including EEU incentive programs and other things that could bring that rate up. I mean, that's actually one of the reasons it fell, is that the participation in EVT's above code programs decreased. So I don't think it's all appropriate to either forecast like you do on the UEI. We haven't made those decisions, and it has to be cost effective, or to have a declining compliance rate. There's another statement in the report that says that too. That was in the original report, and I vigorously disagree with having that assumption.
So just to follow up, that was in the one of the items under the analysis section in the AIA edits is that residential construction is likely less compliant than the NMR report estimates, and it points to a couple different reasons for making that statement. So that kind of relates.
Is there
to
another
chart.
study that, I mean, this was a study that was done, and I'm not saying the study's perfect, but you know, I don't want to make opinion statements that aren't based in facts or a study.
So it's based on EAN report and RB certificate filings, which are described in the analysis section. And it's shown on the proposed chart as a dashed line. So it's trying to be clear that there is a recorded compliance trend line and there's a projected trend line.
Could we just flag this for now?
Yeah. Yes,
Thank you.
say, we can The EAN that you're referring to here, are we talking about Energy Action Network's annual report?
Yes.
So am I reading the report wrong? Was it only 27 homes we're basing this on?
25 actually.
Yes, that is an issue with the study.
That's alarming.
When we get to our version, we have a map of which ones, where those houses
I mean,
were.
were they people that called in and offered to do it? I read the limitations. It said most people wouldn't let them in.
It was,
It-
it was in the middle of COVID.
Yeah, it was.
I know, I get that, but
It's
I read it.
So people did.
It's a random survey that was done, and then survey participants, this, correct me if I'm wrong, because I didn't do that. I believe that's how it worked for RVs. And survey participants were then asked to participate in the onsite. And because of COVID, I typically our range is to get 100 participants between EBT's program and our on-sites, and we had 27 because of COVID. So
Yeah, I'm just trying to
it is,
Yeah, we had
the
a,
study is not perfect.
This again, we actually have two diagrams about this, so we could just flag this now. But there were only 25 houses visited, and 13 of them were in Chittenden County. So there were only, I think, 5 visited on east of the Green Mountains.
but I will point out that there was data collection done on a lot more buildings than that through the app. And part of what the 25 buildings that we went to look at was to see how accurate the results were that they reported through the app, which included windows, insulation levels, all those different things. So part of what we were looking at when we were looking at those 25 homes is how accurate their reporting was, and we tried to extrapolate that to the larger data set that we had through the app.
Yeah, that's true. The survey was different this year than we've ever done before, where the survey typically asked pretty broad questions. This one, we asked people to put in like actual model numbers for their heating system, stuff like that, very specific things, take
Pictures of the nameplates of
we've never done that
equipment and
before,
stuff.
so it did get more information than what
It
typical,
it was interesting.
but
But
we shouldn't go further
Yeah,
into
I'm good,
that,
I'm
the
good.
study, yeah,
I'm good.
there's, yeah,
I mean,
the study's the study.
The important point that we haven't brought up that I think is relevant here though, is that the study is based on homes that were built to the 2015 code. And here we are 2023. And so, we're actually, and we have it's at least a code cycle behind. So I think there's some statements that we made here about less than 50% compliance today. And that, the number says 54, but we've ratcheted the code up, once now, and then again in July it will go up. So the likelihood that it's less than 54% is probably relatively high, although we don't have.
Yeah, I still don't think we should be making those assumptions. I don't. And it does say in here it's compliance with 2015.
Yeah.
It's in the text, so. But we
So
should
I
move on.
Sorry, I don't-
No, that's okay.
I just want to understand
Yep,
what I'm considering.
yep, for sure.
Right, and perhaps we can just, so Richard, to your point, that, there's 2 code changes since 2015. We could be just pointing out that we don't have the data to see if the compliance rate is altered.
That is true.
Would like to add a comment if I could.
Yeah, and I can't see who it is.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah,
Thanks, Matt.
so I think
Go ahead.
that the projection that the AIA proposed is in line with other text in the report. So if we don't like the projection, we should strike the assumptions in writing below. And then just the 54% thing, I think it might be worth making a comment about how we talk about compliance and reassessing that so we can be consistent across time and talk about what we're trying to accomplish. I don't think the 54% is at all related to what the current EUI is. So to compare the two together is odd because EUI is probably going down, even though compliance is at 54%. It's like saying, hey, if 5 of us, if the goal is everyone has 10 marbles and 5 of us has 9 and 5 of us has 10, that's 50% compliance. But we still are progressing towards lower energy use.
So-
Maybe for
so
future
is-
discussion.
So is the graph wrong? I mean, we tried to pull together the fact that compliance rates are going down while the energy code requirements are going up. You know, I mean, that was the sort of visual point behind this. Is it not conveying those two divergent directions?
That we agree with that statement, and we're trying to help it. We've actually spent several hours on this graph. That when you start to compare that the numbers on the right side are in the opposite direction of the numbers on the vertical axis on the left side, it starts to get confusing. But then also, I think the whole point of this is that if you keep the status quo in place, likely the EUI has to go up for us not to get sued and, you know, miss our global warming objectives. So that trend has to go up. And then the fact that it is probably going to keep continuing with our status quo, I don't know if anybody disagrees with that in this room, with the status quo of everything, the amount of training going on, the lack of an authority, et cetera. It is headed on a downhill slope. And I think that's more than anecdotal. And we talk about that. I think we should flag this whole thing and go forward, because otherwise this one chart does have some problems as it's been presented so far. But the intent of it, we agree with, right, Matt?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, great.
I sent a comment to Richard and Liz and Kelly that I thought this graph would be more intuitive if you just flipped you didn't have an increasing EUI and you just flipped the red line over so that they're both declining.
We tried that.
Yeah.
We did try that.
You know, to me, that's
Yeah.
more intuitive, but I could see how other people could. Especially for a non-energy person, I think that's more intuitive. Because just your colleagues in the legislature, they're not even gonna, getting them to understand a lower EUI is better. That's what I just find more intuitive myself, but.
Yeah, I wonder if it should just say like stringency, because that's what it is. The
Right.
stringency of the
Right.
codes are increasing and the compliance is declining. Yeah, maybe just.
I think the eyeballs, I think this chart says exactly what it needs to for given the 2 seconds that anybody's going to look at the chart, which is that one is trending one way and one's trending the other way. The problem's getting worse over time, right? I think it conveys that just fine.
Okay. We'll keep going. It is, I will confess that when I first saw it, I had realized that the, 2 axes built into one thing, especially with sort of the flip scale on one, it's like, okay,
Yeah,
wait,
yeah,
now let me think about what's happening. It's a little tricky.
And if I just, this may be a question, I'm gonna play the role of a layperson here.
Yeah.
Like when I said, so EUI, I mean, I've heard of it, but like part of the question that came to my mind was, so if you're fuel switching and you're adding EVs, does your EUI go up? And the reason I ask that is, I don't know the answer to that. I kind of don't know. I mean, I see that things are trending in opposite directions, but like, is the increase in EUI actually potentially a good thing? Or is it? And I'm not trying to be a pain in the butt here. I'm just saying, if other people, other legislators and others, I'm somewhat informed on this, but I don't necessarily. But these days with energy consumption, especially when we get to electricity, I don't know exactly how to read this. So I'm just throwing that out in case it raises a larger question about the graph. I
Just
don't.
leave the narrative that the narrative says as codes are stringency are increasing, compliance is just decreasing.
And if I'm being dumb about this, let me know.
No, you have really good points. You have really good points.
We actually think a graph is important to show here. I think graphs are more quickly grasped it just needs more work. I'm wondering if we could move to the next, if everyone's ready, the paragraph that begins the decrease. There's a confusion in the draft. This is again a flag. There's a confusion in the common draft throughout the document. Fire safety has jurisdiction over every kind of building in Vermont except for owner-occupied single-family homes. So this sentence is wrong. The only thing they do, it just should say owner-occupied single-family right in the middle there instead of 1 to 3. And then the next paragraph we would.
So you're saying that it's not but not owner-occupied.
Owner-occupied single-family homes is the term that is consistently used in construction.
Is that right, Mike?
That's correct.
Okay, so is that right now? Because I struggled with this a little bit, so is that correct as it's written now? Because you're right, this is critical
Correct.
to this. Okay.
Do you oversee all multifamily, including duplexes?
Yep.
Correct.
Okay.
They just don't, they haven't yet put IRC into their code.
Yeah.
For so the next paragraph, again, a flag, there is a fundamental misunderstanding by the author about the relationship between building codes and statewide energy codes. In some aspects, what she wrote is correct, but I just like to flag that we'd like to talk about that more at length when we're able to go through our version. Because let's just talk about it later.
But your comments are on this paragraph that it is important to note that one.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Flag on mine, thank you.
It's actually kind of farther down in the paragraph. There's confusion there.
Kelly.
Yeah, we're gonna provide some track changes on the sentence, but there is currently no statute or statewide mechanism that establishes statewide authority for, and then the list. We do code interpretation and some of these other things. So I just want to make sure it's clear what the department fire safety does and does not do. So, but there is currently no statute or statewide mechanism that establishes statewide authority for. I don't think that statement is fully correct on what statutes say right there. So I just wanted to throw that out. That
we
want
also
to make it
changed
clear.
that. Yeah.
Okay.
We also changed that area. Flag.
Okay. Anything else in that neighborhood?
One other flag, we suggested bringing up the Venn diagram chart up to this area because it is a useful graphic. Right now, I don't know where it is in the document. I think it was at the bottom because it wasn't,
You're talking about the
circles.
the
the circle
comparison?
diagram.
Okay, with the various
It's currently
authorities.
on page 13. We'd like to bring it up to this point. Again, just a flag.
Yeah, and if we, I'd like to know more about it. I don't find it particularly, it makes me wonder why there are different sizes and things like that. I don't, there's some parts of that graphic that I'm not sure what they're saying, or if they're just ornamental.
I think
Colors
often,
and different sizes, and is that indicative of something, or it's just so?
let's talk about it. Yeah.
Right. All right. So we are at PEC SC also discussed the negative impact of Arby's compliance on builders. So that's where we're at. Any comments in that section?
Flag, we moved that down to increase we felt it was more readable in the flow.
Anything in terms of the content?
Let me check. We did a lot of wordsmithing in the document, so they're small, but actually quite a bit of it is intact. But I just would like to flag that at this point,
sure.
rather than be definitive, sorry.
So I think then the next real topic, when we get into building failures and that picture, Kelly.
Yeah, I wanted, and there's a statement, lack of knowledge of how to comply with energy code coupled with a lack of a residential building code has resulted in a rising number of building failures and sick buildings. And my comment there was needs a reference to the information that's quite a statement, and needs a reference to the information that backs that up.
So we disagreed with pretty much everything in that sentence. So what we suggest doing is, first of all, not having implicit language that makes builders sound lazy or ignorant, and focus instead on the facts of the rising failures, usually thermal failures. What we're suggesting doing is have an appendix in the back that has verified case studies. And also, we have some rewording. So this is, again, we're just flagging right now, but we also suggest going right into discussing what the factors are that are causing the failures, which we feel are lack of training and lack of oversight. We also would like to point out, if there were an authority over this, that it would become an opportunity to improve building science, which actually could help the whole nation, because we're a state with very cold climate and old buildings. We probably stand out in the nation for our combination of old buildings and cold climate. Like, we're probably the state with the highest combination.
With the lack of a tracking system about building failures, I just don't think it's appropriate to use the word rising building failures without something that shows that word rising.
We did show that.
There is
Yeah.
Did have increasing number of at least reported issues.
Are you talking about the Attorney General? The Attorney General comments?
And then also the Sunrise.
Those were mostly not building failures. I mean, heating systems being improperly installed, solar, comments like that. Most of them were not
energy code related, period. But
most of them are not.
No, but I mean, installation's not covered necessarily by the energy code. The equipment sizing and efficiency is, but how it's installed is not an energy code related issue.
It's part of trading, wouldn't you agree?
Tangentially, yes, I would agree, but I think that really,
I think our fundamental position is to try to, as neutrally as possible, focus on real problems and trends. And we're not trying to, there's no blame game in this. We just would like to get it solved. The OPR Sunrise report said this is the major consumer protection issue facing Vermont. And this is, I don't think we need to blow it up. we don't need to be more incendiary than we have to be, but it is pretty clear. And then the other point we make is that there's no single authority. If there were an authority, people would know as soon as they discover the problem to call. As soon as it gets into a lawsuit stage, people with major failures can't talk about it. So we have no way at this point in Vermont to track the significant failures. And these are not just anecdotal. These are things that we have photographs of where, for instance, I have a client that had a 10-year-old house. They had to replace their entire roof because insulation was installed incorrectly. And I could agree with you that it's not a code issue, that maybe they had the right amount of insulation, but I don't think the owners care about that as much as the fact that it was installed incorrectly and they have mush for a roof.
Yeah.
It had to be torn down.
I would think that this analogy is similar to, even though we have architects and structural engineers designing new buildings, we have plenty of building component failures, even in new construction. We have roof collapses, we have a number of issues that we stumble across, and we don't have a tracking system in place to provide good data, and even in fact to even identify trends and have data to back that up. And I think that's what Kelly's alluding to, is that good data in, we can get good data out, and that should be part of this report, is how do we improve the data collection on this? Because I'm concerned about all the failure reporting, but where's this data coming from? How is it being gathered? And there is an education and training component. I think we all agree with this, but I mean, even with our best contractors and our best designers in place, things happen, and we do have misdesign. I'll tell you, the Stowe Mountain, I'll just use this as an example. Stowe Mountain Spruce Peak Lodge, something like 750 code-related change orders on that particular structure, brand new. So what do you do when you have 200 fire doors that have an inch because the concrete is settled on 3 of the floors? Those are indirect cost and deficiencies that we find, but we don't have any way of collecting this data and saying, you know, this is a widespread issue. So I'll just,
Or that it's rising.
Well,
Right,
hold on, because
right.
we did not put in this report, in our version, that fire safety is often the first entity that gets a call from a frantic homeowner. And they are faced with having to tell the homeowner, I'm sorry, we can't help you. We have no jurisdiction over this. And this is often things having to do with energy code related failures. And that turn into structure. And there's no avenue, and they're not recording. We've asked them but anecdotally, one of the regions is getting 3 to 5 calls a week with this kind of failure. And they don't keep records because they have no authority over it. But that would be a natural place that already is a place that people are calling. If we could have a record of it, we could begin to fix the building science. I mean, I am curious as heck. I worked on a building that got spray foam foundation during the flood, and it failed horribly because water got up and destroyed the sill beam of a 200-year-old building. It's just, we learn by failures.
I just want to point out, it's not a failure of the energy code. It's a failure of people to follow the energy code.
I don't think.
I know it seems
one's attacking
pedantic.
the energy.
I know it seems pedantic when you say energy code failure. That's what people. It's a failure of the energy code. It's not. It's a failure of people following the energy code. So it comes back
You're
to that
in that
education
category.
and compliance.
I
It
would
just-
building
yeah.
science.
Yeah, or the building science. I just worry,
I agree.
it just
Yeah, nobody's
irks me.
attacking the energy code.
I think the language.
Yeah, it's clear.
But there's no need to be defensive about it.
A more steady data collection effort would be helpful to
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that was honestly one of my recommendations in the very, very beginning of this was that I don't believe that we have good data to make a decision to make a huge 10, 20, $50 million investment. And in order to convince people, we're gonna need to, I mean, when I look at this, and I'm a numbers guy, the Attorney General's CAP program had 52 properties over 11 years, according to this. That's an average of 5 per year. How many homes do we have in the state of Vermont? How many homes are we building? What percentage of that? 2,000. I mean, this is de minimis, if anything. I have a hard time going in and saying we have a huge problem. The house is on fire, it's burning, when we have a de minimis number that we're dealing with. And I think that was why I said at the very beginning, we're running around like doctors without a prognosis right now. And I think that there's some great stuff that's in here, but when I see some of this, we think that there's more, there likely is more, probably, that doesn't sell me. I have a hard time with it. That's my comment.
Well, we do quote the OPR report that, we put it in our, here. This is quoting and with a bit of an ellipsis. Vermont homeowners are being harmed to a degree that would be considered significant by any reasonable observer. And the CAP numbers are a last resort for consumers who are trying to get some kind of restitution. And they're usually low because anyone else, I think it's like $30,000 that is the trigger for being worthwhile for an insurance company to sue. And then everything that's above that, it's a non-disclosure agreement. So, I mean, that's why
We
the
did
number.
look at a document from that department in this committee that showed the overwhelming majority of the complaints that they received were not found. So I don't understand.
That was fraud. They only look at fraud.
Well, right, and then now we have 5 a year that are going, and again, they are not related to building code by the majority. So I'm just saying, I think that we need to consider what we're presenting to the legislature as it's gotta be.
Well, we also removed all of the specific complaints about building code. These are only energy code related ones. Sorry for the terminology.
When you're talking about the OPR, our only
Yep.
energy code, solar is not related, is not an energy code. Like Barry said, the mechanical and plumbing installation is not an energy code.
What would you call a leaking roof from an improper
That
installation?
wasn't the majority of the solar comments. They were about getting told they were gonna get a certain rate by the, like, Solar City or whoever, and they didn't get it.
Those were
That was-
eliminated out of the numbers that we put in our report.
I'll go back. I think with the numbers, just need to
Anything
be
about
clear
fraud
about
was
what they were
removed.
saying.
Anything.
I don't think.
So for the numbers that are in the common draft that we're looking at right now, is there an issue with the accuracy of what's reported? Matt, I get your point about what percentage, and it might be helpful to know the scale of the reporting compared to the scale of what's going on. But in terms of, so let's see if we can get more clear about that. In terms of the reporting, since 2012, for instance, there have been 36 complaints related to HVAC, et cetera. Is anyone saying that these numbers are not correct numbers?
I think it's just relative scale to the potential problem.
Well, and there's an inference of whether they're tied to energy code as well. It's the inference is that these are tied to energy code or building code, and I don't think that that's true. I'm going to go back through the numbers, but like Barry said, I think for the most part they're not.
Right. I mean, there's
Even the solar roof issue, that's not an energy code
We don't
issue.
require a solar, that's a customer's choice to have that.
That's not an energy.
No, that's energy code.
Well, what is it related to other states too? percentage. I mean, you can go to a state that has residential building codes and you can find complaints all day long. It's gonna be relevant to the house, the number of properties that are existing. I mean, if you ask me today, and again, having been on over 1,000 building inspections in my life, this doesn't seem like the house ain't on fire. Pardon my vernacular there, the house isn't on fire.
Right. So let's see if we can find some information to help create a context of how big a window we're.
Wait. Points. It's in the code. A lot of.
It's
Can I say something?
It's an
not a
option, it's not a
requirement.
requirement.
I don't care. It's where a builder thinks and a homeowner thinks of. And it is. The reason why you would install solar on your house is to offset something else.
That is not there. That is not, you can't make that statement that that's a reason.
Well,
Can I say something? I want to interrupt here.
Yeah, who is, is it Jim?
This
Jim
is Jim.
Bradley, yeah.
Yeah, it's Jim Bradley here.
Yeah, please.
You know, I Grant, yeah, if you can hear me all right, that'd be great. Basically, I mean, I'm hearing this, and I would love to have this committee go with me on a daily basis when I go out to the homes and I do find these issues in climbing into the deep, dark recesses of attics and crawl spaces and basements and finding out where these failures have historically occurred and are currently occurring in new buildings and new construction. This is a fundamental disconnect in understanding of building science for our climate and how to build assemblies. When we're increasing the code to go for higher prescriptive R values and lower U factors in our assemblies, yet we're not making sure that the fundamental understanding on how to build those assemblies appropriately, how to actually not just say the insulation's on site in the garage, but it's not doing anything to help the energy efficiency of the building, we're missing it. Because when the assembly with good efforts and good intentions are put together, but a lack of fundamental understanding on how to get it right, and then when you get big areas right, but little areas wrong, you exacerbate the problems in the wrong areas. And so unless we have that understanding, and unless you actually see what I see on a normal basis, you're not going to appreciate the failures and the magnitudes of how these things are increasing. And it also comes into play when you're taking older building stock and you're improving it. Like you say, okay, we got an 1800s farmhouse, and now we want to go ahead and foam everything in the basement, and where foam has its place, yes. But if we try to foam a box sill, the supporting beam on the stone foundation, and then we cause it to rot out in a year or two because we didn't understand vapor drive and moisture intrusion and everything else, we're missing the mark. So it's not just hitting the prescriptive R values of the insulation or the U factor of the assembly or the windows. It's about understanding how the assemblies to go together, but also ensuring that the contractor did understand that and did perform that work appropriately. And that's the disconnect with the code. It's not just increasing the numbers or lowering the numbers, depending on what you're trying to achieve, to get the results to say we're meeting efficiency standards. It's more so is the durability of the structure being watched over appropriately, being built appropriately, and are the occupants going to be remaining safe? And I think that's the number one thing that we have to get to here, because these failures are occurring. It's not anecdotal information doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Anecdotal information means, yeah, these stories are coming out, but a lot of the customers I deal with, they don't want to go to a lawsuit. They don't want to go report anything. They're just frustrated and they say, how do I fix my home and get this right? And that's what I'm seeing. And there isn't a database where we can report all this. We don't have an official who's going to be collecting this, who's paid to do this. And so that's a big, heavy lift. But to say because that doesn't exist in the state, it's not happening, is an incorrect assumption, in my opinion.
No one's saying it's not happening, that's for sure. You're right. I mean, monitoring and tracking of this issue is definitely going to be key. But I mean, I'm not sure that energy codes is the leading factor for home failures or anything along those lines. It's contributing, perhaps, but I mean, I think it's fairly evident that what really seems to be the issue here is making sure that the builders understand what they're doing, not just for the energy code, but for everything else as well.
I have a question then. Jim, you're in the field, or anyone else can chip in on this. Are you distinguishing between if someone follows the code 2020 or 2023, are are you saying that even if they follow the code, they can still end up with issues because it's not just the code, but it's understanding the code well enough to address, for instance, ventilation.
Everything else.
The application of the requirements.
Right.
Yes, exactly. So you understanding the code for what iteration you're following is very important. And when I've done investigations for when a certain home was built and they've experienced failures, you go back to, okay, what code had, was in effect at that point in time. And I just got called to do another deposition for another failure. And it was basically, okay, what was in effect at that time? What caused this? And it was a fundamental lack of understanding of what needs to be done in our climate, though they were hitting our values. They were hitting U factors, but the assembly was put together inappropriately without respect to vapor drive and simple building science. And that's where the failure was coming in. So it is important to have better efficiency goals. I get that, but I also understand, how do we put this together? How do we put all the parts to a car together to make sure it can actually function and not just say we got a parts in a crate and it's good? That's what's really important.
That's exactly the analogy.
Yeah. So I mean, so great. I mean, I've sensed this in our conversations, but I don't know that we've gotten quite so explicit about it. That to distinguish between code and results in the field, you can follow
Understanding the
code,
building
but
science.
yeah, you have to
Well,
have
to
integrated
you know-
approach so that you're implementing the code in a way that's successful as a build.
Right.
Correct. Correct.
I agree with Jim. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Jim that there are people that need to improve how they operate their businesses. And I think there's a lot. And in my experience, when I was a realtor, I oftentimes would go up against the fact that you'd have a real savvy builder that would say, come in and work with me directly, right? And work with me directly. You don't need that realtor around. I'll take care of you. And it wasn't the Jim Bradleys of the world,
Right.
just for clarity, Jim. But they would love it when they could get someone in. They didn't know what they were doing. Timelines didn't work together. The money didn't work the way that it was supposed to. And that's what the civil court's for. And that's what having building inspections is for. And that's what the infrastructure that we have built around us is for currently. And it's the responsibility of the contractor to understand their craft so that they don't get into that situation. And whether it's my road and bridge builders, my electricians, my residential builders, my commercial vertical builders, they have to go to college, or they have to become an apprentice, or they have to learn their craft. Otherwise, the penalty for them not doing their job is civil litigation. And I think that's something that we have to, that's something that we're considering in our conversations, whether it's talking about the code, whether it's talking about required training, whether it's talking about licensure of these individuals. They're responsible for the job and the product that they produce. And if they don't know what they're doing, I think that was one of the lead reasons why we supported the builder registry, was that we could get bad actors out there so that people like Jim could put a certification up that says, I am certified leads, or I'm certified in whatever program you have. I think that's something that's very important. I agree with Jim that there are people that need to learn better, but whose responsibility is that?
Well, and I want to go back to, Barry said, made the comment about, Jim's talking about the failures that he's seeing. Barry's talking about the fact, well, that's not energy code failure, that's an implementation failure. But the problem with the energy code getting more and more stringent is that it makes those building installation failures worse when somebody thinks they're hitting the code, but they're missing the details. And reality is where too many builders get their information is at the counter at the lumberyard. And they're just going to say, hey, this new code requires R5 continuous insulation. And so they're going to say, well, send it to me, right? And that's how it ends up getting installed. And so as people think they're trying to hit the prescriptive values of the code, but they don't have the fundamentals of the building science behind them, the failures that Jim is seeing in the field are going to get worse and worse and worse as we go through time. So again, it's just a little correction of Barry saying that that's not the energy code's problem. Well, it is. The energy code is creating it by telling people to go out and do it wrong, or to hit a value that they're then going to install in a wrong way, where they probably wouldn't have done that. They probably would not have done that if there wasn't the code. They would have just built things the way they always have, which historically things have worked okay.
I may have missed it. I mean, that to my mind, that's like, especially with existing construction. And if you look at the law, the way it's supposed to apply is any modification to a building, is supposed to apply to these, to lots of work on existing homes. And to my mind, what he said is an absolutely critical point, because it's not even necessarily to do anything nefarious. They even may be calling the manufacturer, right, and saying, what's the application rate of this for this? And of course, the manufacturer even is looking at what their lab results say and everything. It's not necessarily, I'm in the basement of a house that's built in 1838, and every spring we get about a foot of water in here that comes up because of the high water table. I've got dry rotted sills all around me here, a few rubble foundation, granite blocks. What do I do here? They're not asking the manufacturer that. They're not necessarily asking the guys, but the standard would be this is what you're gonna do down there, right? And so how do we make these high performance building systems apply to a low performance building that was built to breathe like a track star?
And that's exactly right. Like I'm in the middle right now in my own personal house. I just bought a 1790s stone house. I'm renovating it. And if I were to follow the code, I would be doing things that would kill that house in years. And so the energy code prescriptively is telling me I need to do these things to the basement because I'm renovating it. But I know from a building science standpoint that if I do that, the house is a goner.
Can I add?
Well, I think it's Colin. Is he a hand up?
Oh, yeah, Colin.
Thank you, Senator. I think this is a great discussion, and I think Jason said it pretty well right there. Back in 2015, the Energy Code basically mirrored best building practices in conventional construction techniques. As we've gotten beyond that, the construction techniques required to achieve Energy Code have become newer, different, and less ubiquitous, and they don't work as well. In the extreme example Jason just cited of a 1790s house, clearly makes sense that would be different. But just in the everyday construction of how homes are being built, this continual upgrade of these codes and of this Energy Code is the fundamental problem that I've seen in the field, experienced in the field, and have talked to people and have been on these committees for the last several upgrades of RBs. And the piece where we keep saying we have to increase RBs every 3 years becomes a problem without these other pieces. It's not to say that there isn't individual failures and that people don't do things wrong, but we are pushing people to do things that don't work in lots of situations with these codes improperly trained, improperly implemented.
Is it fair to say that you can follow the code and end up creating problems?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it is fair, and especially because
I was going to say the problem that really is that the Energy Code, as it becomes more complex, is minor details become more important. And if you fail to be detailed orientated when you're doing it, that's where you're going to run into and create your failures. And it doesn't even have to be a big thing that you miss. It can be a small thing, and that can really drive the issue. And it's a real detail issue, and it's paying attention, and it's really understanding what it is. So it really, in my mind, it all comes back to that central issue of making sure people know what they're doing, building science-wise, and they follow the best building practice as we try and do and we implement and create the Energy Codes.
So when we talk about good building practice or implementation of with good knowledge of building science, is that a more, I don't know, a properly, I don't know, more properly the domain of having a building code as opposed to energy code?
They work in
If I may-
concert, or they're supposed to work in concert. Your energy code and your building codes are yin and yin. Oh, I can't even say it. Yin and yang. It's the Ouroboros, or they feed off one another. Now we do have the IBC, which can provide a lot of the details for like roofing details and everything else, so you can refer to that. But because when you're looking at single families, most people don't really look at the IBC. They think, oh, the IRC, but that doesn't exist in Vermont, so therefore they can do whatever they want as long as they hit the milestones within the energy code. But hitting the milestones within the energy code doesn't mean that you're doing it right. And that's the problem.
And I don't know how you effectively have a code without permits and inspections. And I know that's going to be a challenging thing in Vermont to even talk about, but I really don't know. I mean, you can count on people's best interests and best efforts, but like, you exist for it. I'm pointing to the fire marshal here. You exist for a reason. You do a lot of work for a reason. You have a lot of people out in the field for a reason. You're doing a lot of plans for a reason. And to assume that there's some other area of code, including like individual, owner-owned home what's the term? Anyway, single-family residential. To assume that that should just get a pass because it's inconvenient and inefficient. That's a problem, and I admit I'm biased because I used to oversee inspections and permits, but that's where you catch a lot of problems up front, and it's also where you start getting data, and that's where you can tell a builder there's an education component, right? If there's a violation, you say you're in violation of this element of the code. We're going to stop work until this gets fixed, and then you fix it. But there's an education component to it. It's not just enforcement for enforcement's sake. There's an education component to it and everything. But I just want to put that out there because I know that's not a popular opinion among anything, and we don't want to pay for anything, but that's, in my mind, is a critical element.
So Craig, I have a question for you, because you guys have to build the structure code, right?
Well, we build to our own, we have our own sort of advanced.
It's beyond stretch code.
Beyond, we have a pretty aggressive.
Yeah, and so what's the prevalence of building failures, issues in?
Minimal, because we're just on this topic. Our architects and builders we work with bigger GCs usually that are, knock on wood. Knock on wood. I don't want, Jim showing up at our buildings.
But you have had, there are some.
Oh, yeah, there are some. It's all about moisture, and it's really understanding moisture flow. That's the most important thing that we touched on here.
The most important thing on multifamily projects that we worked on when I was in 3D Thermal was having an energy consultant person on site with the installer.
Exactly.
When they're installing the first window,
right?
You think they're doing the right thing. Yeah. Well, so here's where it's leaking. Here's where the problems. And so that is really one other thing I want to say here that I'm hearing from this conversation. I'm really seeing a distinction between new construction and everything else, including additions and everything that RVs right now applies to. But maybe it shouldn't. Maybe what we're talking about is let's stop building substandard buildings by increasing the energy code to ultimately to a net zero ready standard. But you can't apply that to existing structures easily. You really need somebody who understands the dynamics, especially the moisture dynamics.
To that point, RVs is essentially a new construction code, and it does have the pieces for additions, which technically would be new construction as well, technically. And then you've got obviously your repair, renovations, etc. And within that, there's a lot of exemptions associated for existing buildings that you wouldn't have to do. Various pieces. You don't necessarily always have to meet the energy code if you have an existing building and you can't do it in a practical fashion, or it's not going to be safe. Those exist within the code.
The single.
I've got to interrupt. My hand's falling asleep. So,
Well, I'm trying to balance out time.
I know,
Yeah, we even got
So,
recommendations.
yeah, and then briefly, Sandy, and then we're gonna.
I'll keep quiet.
No, it's like, I'm not interested in peeping over problems. So it's good that it's coming up, and I just don't sense we're gonna sort it all out. So at the moment, collecting the comments is helpful, and then let's continue review. So Craig, that's.
I was just gonna say, the most important thing, and we touched on it here, is just the change that Colin referred to and that Jason has been referring to for, talking about 2015. Once you get into continuous insulation, that changes the dynamics of the flow of the wall, of how vapor flows. So that's, I think, I would suspect that's some of the failures Jim's seeing. Just the changes are just important to understand. So we have to, however this pans out, that message needs to get out to the smaller contractors that are working in the residential space. Because we've had several years to work with 3E Thermal, over a decade on the larger multifamily and senior projects to get it right, hopefully. So that's a serious, important thing that needs to get out there.
so I'm going to try to, so 3 flags. One is that the way it works in all other states is that they either have a standard of care, and the standard of care with an authority is applicable to both existing buildings being changed and to new construction. And it actually extends with an FPA over existing buildings as well. Then, so you can have a standard of care, or you can have some form of licensing for contractors, which also refers back to a standard of care, or you can have both. All other states have a path to one or the other except for Vermont. Vermont is the only state that for residences has no path. And so we are left with civil litigation, which is a pretty horrible way forward for homeowners, for property owners. The bar against that without a standard of care mean that the lawsuit could go on for 10 years. And most people run out of savings. So I think what we're asking for, the idea of licensure or mandatory certification is not going to work in Vermont. So what we're asking for is just a standard of care. There's a question of whether that can work without enforcement. And talking a lot with fire safety about this, particularly Bob Sponable, I think the answer is yes, at least for now. And what we really miss in Vermont is someone that can collect information and that can answer questions about what the right thing to do is. So a lot of the questions are about retrofitting existing buildings. And there is no one really authoritative now to ask. So one of the flags is that we propose that the call center be expanded to really help those kind of people that have existing buildings, or they're already beginning to see a problem. And the call center would be most appropriate under fire safety, who could help them answer the questions. And the other thing would be to start certifying weatherizers, insulators, solar installers, and all of the sources of these small complaints. There's no, you don't have to have any kind of electrical background to install solar panels. And you don't even have gone to trade school, and they are doing a lot of damage. The same thing's true with insulators. There's no, unless they're getting certified by one of the manufacturers, which most homeowners don't even know to look for that. So thank you. That was a bunch of flags.
So I think let's push on to the next section, which is Vermont Energy Code background. And I would say, well, I'm hopeful that this is historical information.
I'm sure the department will have some suggestions.
I do have a question, really more on OPR. I just want to make sure I heard correctly. On the sentence that says they evaluate complaints related to builders on the registry to determine if there's been fraud, but does not evaluate complaints for issues related to quality of work. I thought I heard, I just want to check myself, that they could do on-site inspections that would get into more of that quality of work if they were told to do so. That's what I thought I heard, but I'm not sure if I heard correctly.
Well, I could tell you from the profession that I worked in, they in fact do go and inspect records, real estate agents and attorneys and folks that they already are dealing with. I don't know if I'm speaking out of order or not, but I'm real concerned about what we signed on to with OPR 2 years ago. I'm really concerned that we were sold a bag of goods. The bag of goods were twofold. We were going to prevent fraud in the state of Vermont, and we were going to go and we were going to figure out who the contractors were. We were going to message out to the contractors that they must be following the building energy code, provide an opportunity for them to note their certifications. And if you go to their website today, you don't even find a phone number associated with the contractors. They have refused to do any of the work. We have an advisor on the call here, but I can tell you from what I've seen, the bag of goods isn't there. We have a new director. When they came in here, they basically said, we're just going to deal with fraud. And okay, well, what is that? It's a financial transaction that didn't go together? Or is it the fact that someone's disclosing that they're a builder in the state of Vermont and they're following the Vermont code requirements and then they don't follow the code requirements? So I'm real concerned about that. And I think that when we start getting into all of this, whether it's AIAs or it's the graph, it's like we haven't even figured out the problem. That we lit a fuse and walked away from it, and they're not producing.
So anecdotally, I had dinner with a number of people who are both developers and contractors, and I can't remember why, but this came up in discussion, and I mentioned OPR and register, and then they were all going, never heard of it.
Exactly. I'm an Essex resident, and when people post online, who's going to do my kitchen, who's going to do this for me, who's going to do that for me, go to OPR. And then all of a sudden, I have 50 contractors that are assaulting me verbally. That this is BS. We don't have to do this. That's state overreach. Blah blah blah. And so they don't even know in a lot of cases, and they think that I'm trying to manipulate them elsewhere. So it's like we already paid for this engine. We already are taking $200 out of each one of these contractors' pockets every 2 years to register in the system that we built and it failed. To add another system on top of a system that's failed seems like we might want to fix the one that's there first, which was my original recommendation, which was direct OPR to do that second duty, not just the financial fraud duty, but the second duty. That was the carrot that got AGC to even agree to support that bill.
That basically your registration would include a self-attestation that you were aware of and following the energy code.
Yeah, and if Scott sold his brand new house to me that was supposed to meet the building energy code, and I found out that didn't through my home inspector or some other failure or something like that, I'd be able to go back and report Scott's builder, not Scott, because Scott didn't do anything wrong, but Representative Campbell. But I can go back to OPR and say XYZ builder built this house and it's not in compliance with the building energy code. At that point, OPR could, with their attorneys, they hired two for this process, could then go and adjudicate that case, and whether that be a fine, more education, or remove them from the registry altogether. That's what I saw when that was what we understood to be the case, was they were going to assist us in getting the building energy standards done. And now we're looking at going another step higher. And that's, so for my committee that we meet with, we're frustrated. We feel like we were sold a bag of goods that weren't there.
So what would be the step higher? I'm not quite sure.
Well, going to licensure, required trainings, going to DFS, requiring on-site inspections for every single step of the process. That's going too far right now. And I'm not trying to monopolize things here. I'll stop them on my soapbox. But I thought we worked on this for a reason.
Yeah.
And that's where our heads at. So.
Could you provide, I think it'd be helpful in that section to provide information on what you just said, like what the collective we thought that the registry is supposed to do, and that it doesn't appear to be
I'll
doing. I
write that.
think that's really important.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Right, because that was, honestly, on the legislative side of things, it's like everybody, there's this difficult, whatever, gnarly problem. And how do we get a first step to help us start making progress? And part of it was, one of the first big problems was we don't even know who to talk to. So if we get a registry, we'll know who to, and then that at least sets up the communication link that we need. So if it's not functioning as a way to communicate with all the builders, then that's important.
Well, I would think I think it's worth a conversation of, and I think we had said it in another committee, they might not like to do stuff, but when the legislature asks them to do stuff, that solves the problem. I that's just my position on it.
Yeah. Well, I was also a little confused when Lauren was in. I thought she mentioned that there was a requirement to register in 23, but it wasn't mandatory registration until 24.
Yeah, it was available in 23, but it's not mandatory.
Right. So I don't know what kind of effort is. Somebody could say, well, it's incomplete because of this sort of delayed rollout. I'm not making excuses. I'm just trying to figure out, because when I talk to builders and mention this to them, they've never heard of it.
Yeah,
right.
And when are the written contracts supposed to be in place for jobs over $10,000? When is that?
March 24th.
Yeah.
Well, then you also have a requirement of insurance. So we're solving a lot of problems with that, right? So someone builds a home, they don't build it to spec. They have the ability to go back to the builder. The builder has a required policy from the state of Vermont that I don't even need to go to court. I can call the insurance company and file a claim. And then it's up to them to try to defend themselves. So I'm sorry.
No,
But I think all of this stuff is amazing. I think this is well thought out. I think if we had hundreds of millions of dollars, like look at New Hampshire compared to us, they've got a fully robust program, as you've reported out. Their budget's almost triple ours annually.
For
The state budget.
the
amount of money
overall
that
state
they have
budget.
available to put together programs.
They're basically community.
Yeah,
Community of Boston.
So it's like,
Bottom half.
if you could put together something that would be the gold medal of Gold Star thing, that's great, but we don't even have county governments here. So to say that we have to be like everybody else is.
With the Vermont way. Okay, so on this section, I just want to make sure if there's, so thanks on OPR, we need some, you're going to write some information on that. There's
It'll be less colorful.
I just want to make sure that we're covering what we're writing is seems accurate to members of the committee.
We're in complete agreement with the first 4 introductory paragraphs, and then starting where it says past efforts, we've actually divided up into 3 subsections, and we suggested giving them little titles to be clearer. With OPR, a flag for the recommendations, we're going to be proposing that supporting the idea that there are standards for builders that are voluntary, and that a builder would have to pay for their training to gain that voluntary certification. And it might be incentivized by Efficiency Vermont, but that Vermont Fire Safety would provide a generic certification. Anyone could teach the classes, but it would meet the requirements of fire safety. And that generic certification would begin to go on the registry when the registry actually shows up. It's even hard to find. It's impossible to find some
Really
days.
hard to find.
Yeah, like literally impossible. Some days they may have it off. So line, but they.
And if you call it build, if you search on builder or contractor, it doesn't show up if you search builder, it has to be contractor.
Well, I used to know how to find it, but now I can't. Anyway, but the idea would be to deliver a generic certification that could go on this website. And then if the builder wants to add further certifications, they could do that on their
We're going to have to move on from defining what a better program would be.
Okay.
New rating points for more editing. So with that, that would take us through, I think, legislative direction. Wait for our scribe, screen master.
Yeah,
I'd agree.
I think so too.
Yeah. Let's start on page 13.
I mean, we have 3 charges, right? And so, and the recommendations, I feel like they're sort of lumped into each of those 3. Even though we have a longer list under charge 2, the first one, and we reordered this, I hope that's okay. It just seemed like even though the bill had assessed how the building energy code interact with fire and safety codes as number 3, we felt like that belonged sort of setting the stage, and so we moved it up to the top. Sure. Editorial license there. So I feel like we should probably start with that one. Is that appropriate? And then just move our way through each one of them?
Yeah, let's with charge 1.
With charge 1.
Yeah, as you listed it, so for
Yeah.
page 11.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Okay, let's go. Kelly.
Yeah, again, here, I think we have some suggested track changes to be clear, like on the paragraph that starts, Vermont building energy codes interact with 4 agencies in different way, but lack any unified authority among the agencies to oversee the energy codes. That's not correct. The department does oversee the energy codes. I think just being clear about what we mean. That's another, oversee is another word, I think, like administer. Just want to also provide some suggestions on making sure that language is correct about who does and doesn't do what.
Okay. Anything else?
I'm just, Mike, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you, and thank you for being honest and sharing your opinions and your administrations in the past. I just want to make sure that if you're not comfortable with this, that we flag that along the way. And I think it's important for the report to characterize that however you want to.
Right, I'm going to provide a written, I think at the beginning of this meeting, we were offered the opportunity to put, so I'm going to put something very thoughtful together in writing. But I mean, just to start this, I respect what this group is trying to achieve and stuff. What I see here is, and what my comments will be a little bit is, you have 2 different swimming lanes. And I think it was articulated earlier that it is a matter of what it is you're trying to solve. You're trying to reduce failures of improperly applied energy codes, or however you want to term it, to reduce failures and increase energy efficiency compliance. That's one kind of swimming lane. The other one is that you're taking this whole, I'm going to call it state bureaucracy, right, for a lack of words, and you're trying to put all this onto the Division of Fire Safety when in fact we have no trained people, we don't have the bandwidth, the money involved in this, the positions involved with this, the exertion of authority over single family owner occupied homes. Good argument. I'm not disagreeing with what this group is implying. I just think this lacks a very basic framework on how we can address the problem at hand. And that is, how do you get these buildings? And I think it might have been Jim that really emphasized this. You can have all the codes you want, but if you're not doing these assemblies properly, then you're not fixing and addressing the issues that this whole group is presenting as an issue, that we're not complying with the energy codes. What are we going to do about it? I just think it can be pretty simple and basic. Education, training, and incentives. And, you know, and then when you look at all this stuff that's being thrown into the mix here, the IRC, for example, I agree, summer study next year should take place. The IRC, are you gonna keep the sprinkler system requirement in for 1 and 2 family dwellings? I mean, that's in the IRC. Or are you just going to pick and choose what parts you want out of this IRC code? There's a lot of debate that needs to take place. And this all affects, by the way, insurance, ISO ratings and so forth. So I'm just, I don't want to be at all disrespectful for the work that all of you have done. I totally understand it. I'll provide a nice written, so I'm not uncomfortable here writing what my thoughts are. And I appreciate the opportunity to chime in, sir.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is too, I mean, where, part of the reason I think our conversations from the beginning have been, what can we do with, and even this morning's segment, tier 1, tier 2, like what do we need to do now versus what do we know is an issue that needs to get resolved, but it's more than we can resolve. And I also figure if we start making steps that are bring us some progress, it'll put us in a better vantage point to see what the next step will be, as opposed from this point to try to see 7 years worth of steps is pretty hard to do. You know, like, will it make sense as we go ahead and do things?
I mean, we're still on a 2015 IBC and a 2015 Life Safety Code and the NFPA standards. We should be at a minimum at 21 and working right now on the 23 or the 24 years on these adoptions. And we are behind the 8 ball here. And this is really impacting our opportunity for grant funding and stuff like this. That's been stated. So we are under a lot of pressure here to move right now to get the 2021 codes adopted so that we can play in that arena. Yes.
Are you working on rules, drafting rules now?
We are. It's just a very complicated, you're dealing with energy storage systems, explosives. There's just cannabis. There are a lot of complex high ticket items which deal with a lot of partnering with people and financial impact statements to all these changes. It's a very complex situation.
I'm wondering actually, so for the report out, I'm wondering if actually there's a sidebar that says something to the effect of, we're talking here about the, the energy codes and their application, but for the legislature's knowledge, this also has bigger implications beyond, so I brought up the ability to access and you're talking about other grant funding, so that just to make the legislature aware that that yes, there may be some costs associated with like promulgating rules, adopting the code, but also there's a risk of foregoing, especially federal resources that are not designed around Vermont, and they generally assume county government and other things that we don't have. But if we forego these things because they're for whatever reason, we may forego other resources that the state needs now. Sure. And so however we want to do that, but it's maybe helpful just to have that sidebar.
Yeah, I mean, that's to me, that bigger context. We took over such an area where you worked with like, oh, we did our job, but left out the context that lets you see what else is going on around it. You mentioned BRIC. What is BRIC? That's the
Building Resilient Infrastructure program that FEMA has. That's the one that I've mentioned where Stephanie said that Vermont's not competitive because we don't have a building code.
We were one of the first states to obtain a BRIC grant in fire safety, but that is partially because of our relationship that we have with our emergency management director, because I work right across the hallway. So,
but these are the bigger statewide
correct.
Competitive grants. So like, nationwide, there's, I forget, like maybe 100 or so. So right now, what Stephanie was saying, all we get is basically the formula funding. We're not competitive for other additional funds. So.
Just on that section on the recommendation, I don't think that we have a prejudice against fire and safety having it. In fact, if Mike was saying today, heck yes, we have the resources and the ability to move this forward, we could support that. Half my members already deal with the department in the commercial business anyway. So but what he said does ring a bell with me, and it's, I work with a lot of state agencies and they are all competing for human resources right now. Whether it's the Department of Public Safety, Agency of Transportation, Building General Services, they're missing like leadership roles, and much less, some of the other boots on the ground role. So that's a concern to us, is that we wouldn't want to set them up with a charge that they were absolutely, and they're just not, no offense, you're not going to be able to compete with the public sector right now because we pay a lot more. But so there's a staffing issue that's there, but there's also the financing issue. And if we were going to go over to fire and safety on the current financing model that they have, we'd be concerned. Again, we talked about the $16,000 to $30,000 just to follow the building energy code per house. Now you're going to add another level of inspections to each one of those houses, which will get passed down to the consumer because they get paid on their inspections. So we would really, in order to keep housing affordable, which everybody agrees is an emergency, and in fact, the only reason why we're even in this room is because of the Homes for Everyone Act, which is addressing the emergency. I don't see where I could support, and I don't see where I would have a hard time believing the legislature would support making it even more expensive for someone to build a house, knowing, and I say this with due respect, we have some extremely prohibitive development laws. We're spending all of our money in the actual subdivision part of the property. And to add more money on the building of the home vis-a-vis an inspection, and again, 2,000 homes a year, how many people would we have to do 2,000 homes plus existing residential? What does that look like per unit that gets built? Is that too expensive? I think the answer is yes.
We're not recommending that every home be inspected.
I'm not pointing at you,
Yeah.
I'm pointing at him.
Yeah, okay, but I don't think he is either. We're saying that if there's a standard of care and then there's good training that we, as a state.
But they have
it
to
can be
finance the
incentivized.
people
Oh, yeah,
and their training.
absolutely.
So they would need a huge,
Well, no, they don't have to
appropriation.
finance training. We're thinking,
No.
agree with you, the building
His
should pay
people
for
need
it.
training.
Oh, yeah,
So
Definitely.
we would need a huge appropriation for that.
or the
Maybe we should call.
DOE grants, the grants that are helping. We, for this section A, we suggest using action language, strong verbs, and bulleting the top of each specific recommendation in bold. So,
Well, rather, I mean,
yep, because
I know
we
you
have,
a lot of edits on that.
I know. but I wanted to say we had 3 specific ones underneath A. Clarify the chain of authority from the General Assembly through fire safety down to municipalities. That's still an outstanding issue. And we agree with the code update, but the other one we'd like to make sure gets added is establish an advisory committee to fire safety that will advise the overall transition, help with future code revisions, and examine building failures to improve building science.
Richard, I'm not sure where you are on comments and how far along it. There's 2 charges in here where you are.
I think
That
that
was
was,
charge 1.
I think she just wrapped up charge 1, is that right?
That was a,
Actually, you're talking about A, but I'm not sure because we didn't have an A here, so I don't know.
I thought we decided we were skipping charge 1.
Yeah, she stopped over the.
I'm
Oh, you
I'm
were,
in
no, we were in
recommendations.
charge 1, so you were just
Oh,
talking about charge.
I'm sorry, I said A.
A.
Yeah, I'm talking about recommendation
Got
A.
it. Okay.
That family of suggestions.
Okay.
It's just that just having narrative is kind of hard for a person to understand quickly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I wasn't in.
Can I go back to just charge one, a suggestion for charge 1 is that,
Yes.
with that, yeah, this is Jason. It starts off just saying Vermont currently has no statewide fire and building safety codes that cover all buildings. That one could read that and assume that it might not be under one agency, but there are agencies that are at least overseeing everything. I would be more clear to say something along the lines of Division of Fire Safety has jurisdiction over public buildings, multifamily, rental properties. And I would be just clear to then say there is currently no agency with any jurisdiction over owner occupied single family homes of 1 to 3 units.
It's
That's
one
one and
unit
two.
and it's exactly what we wrote in our draft. Word for word.
Okay, so we'll take a look at your points there. All right, anything else in the charge 1 neighborhood? All right, so charge 2 Here,
14.
so starts on the top of 13. Recommend strategies to increase awareness of and compliance with RV procedures.
It sounded like Sandy had some suggestions.
We were able to capture those all.
Yeah, so we'll get those. I think what we were thinking as well too, Senator, you had suggested sort of phase 1 and phase 2.
Right.
And I saw that in Sandy's draft, you had sort of asterisks
Yeah.
that indicated that. I envision, and Scott had suggested, we need a summary of these somehow to sort of boil these down. And we're sort of envisioning a matrix that might have 3 columns that would be, that would have each of these anyhow, they would have each of these A through F or whatever they're going to be, and then any detailed recommendations below each one, but then group them into, indicate whether they were sort of phase 1 immediate needs or phase 2, and that would sort of summarize them, but then also provide a visual indication of whether these are short-term or longer-term efforts.
If you look at our charts 26, 27, they're the same as they were the last time they were shared with the group. That's just a beginning point of how you could organize that information.
So is that along the lines, what, so Sandy's page 26, that's the kind of thing we're talking about?
It could be. These, we have to do sort of a crosswalk between, these. The A through F in here, where we tried to sort of pull out the discussions that the committee had earlier and boil them down into, some succinct, AIA helped a lot of this. So, 6 different sort of major topics. I don't know whether AIA, page 26, how general authority, promulgation, compliance, verification, documentation, training, education, how those relate to the A through F tasks here. So there need to be some sort of compare and contrast, but
sure.
And maybe I don't know if you were thinking in terms of time frame, what years, by 2024, because Sandy's draft has 4 different columns. Does that align with what you were?
Well, one column is current.
Current, yeah.
The next column is in this legislative session enact. And then the next one is in the next, let's say 2 or 3 years. And then the last one was hopefully someday, let's say 2030.
The net zero ready 2030 goal is articulated where?
It's in the comprehensive energy plan, but it also might be, and it might be in a different form, I'm not sure, in the climate plan as well. I don't know if the words are the same. Climate action plan. So, but I know it's in the comprehensive energy plan.
Well, sort of no right answer, but I think the by 2024 is helpful, because that's like, okay, next legislative session, what are we putting on the table for then? 26 is somewhat arbitrary, but it's a subsequent legislative session, and 2030 fits that larger goal. Okay. Works for me. I don't know if people want to suggest a different timeline for rollout.
I mean, it just kind of seems like we're recommending going to DFS. If we just leave it the way that it is.
Yeah.
So that's not something that we're in support.
Yeah. We're the department, and I don't want to speak for Mike, but we're not supportive of recommendation A in any timeline at this point. I think we have the approach more that set of, let's see where the compliance efforts that are in place and can possibly be in place get us first before we leapfrog to a massive financial commitment and infrastructure. So
Maybe A should be the implementation of monitoring and tracking of.
Okay, that's good. And so, Richard, you caught that. I see it.
Is it possible to say where the, and I'm just gonna use this, for lack of a better term right now, where the incremental approach gets us versus where the other broader recommendation gets us? In other words, have the legislature do it, but like if the administration and others are saying we prefer this more incremental approach to it, and there's others on the committee who would recommend a broader approach.
Well, I'm a lobbyist by trade, and I can tell you that the incremental approach has a lot likelier ability to pass the legislature than if we go in there and we ask for an all-encompassing thing, understanding that we're in a housing crisis, understanding that there are tents going up around the State House right now. People aren't able to find homes. People with mental illnesses aren't able to find homes. People that have children are out on the street. If we go in there and we say that we're going to increase the cost of housing, which will limit the amount of housing that's built, it's not going to pass. So that's why if we look at a step that's based on actual facts, numbers, and science, and we do it in an incremental way, it might not, I don't think anyone in this room thinks that we're going to solve climate change with building energy standards. It's part of our world. So it's part of the direction we're going in, but it doesn't have to be overnight.
So I appreciate that position, and I appreciate the politics. I don't know that politics are necessarily the charge of this committee. So why I'm asking, does it make sense to say there's an incremental approach that can be taken? I don't know if you're saying that the broader approach is fundamentally not based on facts or science or anything else, but what I'm saying is, do we, as a group, and this is a question, I'm fine with doing whatever the consensus is. Do we say, based on the information that we've reviewed and the challenge with not having a building code and other things, we're seeing these larger challenges. Maybe the best approach or practical approach is the incremental one, recognizing though that there are other bigger issues, and kind of not necessarily saying you have two paths to take, but that, incremental will get you this far, but there are these larger issues in the offing. So I'm not necessarily saying it's a either or proposition, but for the purpose of the legislature, rather than just precluding the bigger solution and what that might even look like, instead say the incremental approach may very well be the best approach for the reasons you just laid out, but to kind of get where it seems like the statute and everything else has been trying to get us to, you may have other things that you need to take into account. So that's the question I'm asking.
Yeah, this is Jason. What the builders said, I think what we all agreed with when the DPS was doing the hearings for the new energy code, what the builders and AIA, I think, was on there too, is saying is that we've done the incremental approach and kicked this can for as long as we can. Like, we've been kicking it since 1997, and that we've finally gotten to a point where you can't keep incrementally kicking this anymore, that it needs the big rewrite or it needs to stop. Right? There's no, it's kind of like we're at the edge of the cliff. You can't go any further without it. It's dangerous to go further without it. And I think that the thing the legislature could do right now, if they see it the same way, hopefully they will, is to go into the enabling legislation, and it's part of our report, but to really highlight it is to go into the enabling legislation and remove the blindly adopting the latest edition of IECC just because it's come out. And what that would allow us to do is it would allow the DPS to kind of hit the pause button on continuing to raise, right? The DPS says over and over and over again, we have to raise this bar. We have to follow the IECC. The enabling legislation tells us that because there's a new IECC, we have to update our code. And so if we remove that part of the enabling legislation, and then we can just sit where we are for a little while until some of this other stuff is addressed.
Yeah, the other way to look at this is that they're different arenas of discussion here. We've been trying to get at a deep structural misalignment. We would like that the structural system we have could be fixed, acknowledging it's going to take a while to get there. And so the incremental part could be that, we don't change current responsibilities at all for the moment. And then we have a plan to actually get to our end goal. The end goal that I'm aware of is that we have a single authority over all aspects of building. Public buildings and residential buildings could be broken out from each other, but Vermont's small. So if we could have one structure, that would make sense. But granting authority doesn't mean that all of the staff have to be immediately trained, that all of the responsibilities immediately change.
I think you do actually have some concern with that. If you create that authority and something goes wrong, then you could potentially be open to litigation on it. So if you're not going to do something right,
then it has to go. I mean,
So, all right. Starting to feel almost like talking about religion.
I just had a question. I'm a little confused. Kelly, so you're not, the department is not supportive of that, number A?
Yeah.
So are you gonna, what is the incremental, like what, I mean, that's such a major part of this, is to have this sort of new age J, whether it's Department of Fire Safety or someone else. So I'm just curious what you're gonna recommend.
Yeah, I think for us, the incremental is starting more with compliance and fixing the contractor registry, focusing on what that can do, looking at the energy efficiency utility programs and their roles and the incentives, outreach and education, training, like pretty much all the things except enforcement and having that plan review, inspection, that piece is not part of what we see as the current incremental. We want to see how far can we get to, that's the question. I don't think there's an answer, Chris. That's the question, like how far does that get us? Well, we don't know. We haven't tried all those things yet. And we have seen the results of the energy efficiency utilities pulling back on programs. That's had a big effect on our compliance rates. So that's what the department thinks of when we think of.
So are you gonna recommend something? One thing that got brought up a couple of years ago, before I think what percolated and ended up in this discussion is like one option that was thrown out there is people would at least need to contact, they wouldn't have a choice to contact EVT. That would be an option. That like EVT doesn't want to be an enforcement mechanism. They want to advise people, but one backdoor way into getting people to do it is that at least every contractor would need, they have to do the RB certificate. They would at least need to talk to somebody at EVT. Are you going to propose anything like that?
I mean, one of the comments that I have and the later recommendations on the EEU rules is that I've said before, as part of the demand resource planning goal setting and budget process for the EEUs, we have in one of the phases looking at the new construction programs and incentives and maybe making changes to allow them to claim savings and different things. So I don't want to presuppose what happens in a process. Like I would like it to play out and have the options put on the table and think through. There's a lot of, there's trade-offs, right? Like you do certain things, but there's cost implications. So I don't want to kind of presuppose that process and where we would end up. I think everything's on the table for a discussion.
And what the builders are begging, if that's what we're going to do, what the builders are begging for is pause the continuing adoption of the standards. Just hang out, amend the legislation, hang out where we are with the current standards and let some of that stuff play out. Don't just keep ratcheting up blindly, the standards when we know, for all the reasons we've just spent 2.5 hours talking about,
The department is supportive. The department is supportive of changing the statute language from a shall to a may. We think that we'll need that down the road. If you do get to a net zero ready by 2030, then where do you go from there? Like, that's kind of the ultimate, and there may be little tweaks, but I don't think you'd have massive updates after that point. So we are supportive, and instead of saying a specific pause in years, we would just recommend the shall be changed to a may and allow for that assessment.
So to your point, and this might help you too, I'm working on a project right now that I'll probably call you about another time. But I'm working with an electrical equipment distributor who called me, and they've been working with Efficiency Vermont to sell more energy efficient LED bulbs. And through Efficiency Vermont, there is, I think, a $12 per bulb credit. So someone can come in and upgrade their facility, use less energy, and they're able to get this benefit from Efficiency Vermont to do that. So on January 1st of this year, we have, and it's probably for a good reason, we have banned fluorescent bulbs that have mercury in them. And you know what that does is that changes the mercury. Fluorescent bulbs is no longer the lowest standard that you can have. Now LED is the lowest standard, and Efficiency Vermont can no longer give out those benefits. So guess what people are going to do? They're going to take advantage of the fact that the suppliers have a huge supply of these mercury bulbs that they can buy cheaper through the year 2024. And that's what's going to happen. So we're going to take a step back in 2024, unless we can figure out a way to get the incentives back. And people are going to go to the mercury bulbs because they're a heck of a lot cheaper than $16 a bulb.
I want to say that they can still incentivize
They can still
2024 for
incentivize.
that reason.
Yeah.
Okay, because Matt Chapman disagreed with me on that, so I'm going to go
But
back.
we'll,
Yeah.
but yeah, we don't want to get that discussion today.
Especially in.
Yeah.
I'm really confused about what's gonna happen when the department and the Fish Fire Safety come out with different set of recommendations than what we have in front of us.
It's not a different set, it's just that we don't agree with A.
Kelly, if you're gonna do this, I think you need to be really honest and also looking over the entire range of comments that have come in. For instance, there is really no code interpretation, and there's really no mechanism right now to discuss weatherization of existing buildings. And you need to be completely universal across the spectrum of all these problems. With what I can't evaluate what you're suggesting until I know how these things are being dealt with. And we can't do it now, but I would like to see the full. This is meeting number 7, and this is the first time I've heard this.
I know, and this is I'm concerned about process and timeline, and being the receiving end of all of this and trying to make it work. I'm concerned about how we're going to fit this in to our, because I think we're going to need to have another committee discussion about this.
We went through this with the climate action plan too, and that's why there were a lot of it was what was approved, but then there were all the dissenting opinions.
What do we do?
Yeah, I mean, I just have to respond that this isn't the first that we've heard it. Michael said this very early on, and has said it a couple times, so I don't think that's quite fair. And we're not suggesting a whole new set. It's just A, and there's other ones that we are supportive of that are here, so.
But process-wise, we've got Sandy's rewrite, we've got the comments that are coming here. It just feels like we're not done our work as a committee. And so how are we going to get there?
Well, I think we have one community document. I really appreciate AIA's efforts and everything like that, but that's really not the committee's document. So I think if we focus on the committee's document, you've made a suggestion that we have another meeting, that we file I think we should, my recommendation would we all file over the next week before the meeting, what recommendations we think are great ideas. And then someone compile those, and then we bring them back in, and we have a meeting specifically around what the recommendations are. We don't need to argue about the stuff in any of this anymore. But if we come back and we have a conversation about what the recommendations were, we don't have to have the consensus. We're presenting a report, and that report is going to go to the legislature where someone's going to write up the bill. And then we're going to come in afterwards and tell you what we think of the bill that you write. So that would be my recommendation, is we just.
Yeah, and it might just come down to a vote. Like, I've expressed what we would vote on A but that's not what other people might vote.
Sure, well, and I think that's, I like that suggestion, that the next draft focus on the recommendations, which is like the heart of what's gonna help steer what happens next with the bill. The finessing of the data, the history and stuff like that, I think we can do the best we can and acknowledge that we're not gonna solve. This has been an interesting topic because it touches on 100 different aspects of what goes on there. So let's do that. We'll stick with that. So we were talking about timelines before. We said by Friday, comments to Richard. And then by the 13th, the next draft would come out. I'll also work with Richard and Kelly about, I'm going to rethink a little bit. Remember we were saying at the beginning, could we ask a series of questions that relate to recommendations and just poll the group so we have quantitative information, like sort of how we're coming into the next meeting. Maybe that would still be a useful thing, so that it'll just help us get a sense of the room, the bigger room, before we have that next meeting. So I'll work with you on a poll. Are people comfortable with, so in my other, two other slides outside this room, one is, chairing Senate Natural. And so chairs, just by virtue of being the one that usually stays late at night, you end up try to help your own committee by helping gather and edit the document, the draft for the next day. Are people comfortable with me working on behalf of the committee with Richard to try to help prepare that next draft report? So I'll commit to doing that in the most fair and even-handed way I can, but just so that we have the best possible sort of work product to look at next time to help us be productive as a group.
Sure.
Right. So we are a couple minutes over. Sorry about that. Thanks so much.
Did you want to do public comment just to?
Oh, yes, thank you, Mr. Campany. We should close the morning. So thanks for that reminder. Is there anyone on the call that would like to offer public comment this morning?
Gonna run away.
I can see Mr. Brady's ready to go. All right. Well, hearing none, so thank you everyone for, I know it's always awkward to be a meeting that's a bit messy, but life can be messy and we're working on some important stuff. So I thank everyone and we'll stay in touch. We'll be looking to hear from you. I'll be working with Richard and Kelly, Scott on a next draft, getting things back out. And we'll convene in 2 weeks and try to knit things together for a final report. So thank you again, and we are adjourned.
So question for you guys. Where should we work?